Hello, everyone, and welcome to the last in our Material History seminar series for 2023. We're talking about objects of war. I'm Margaret Anderson from the Old Treasury Building, and I'm delighted that you've been able to join us today. Let me begin by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you from the unceded land of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation. We thank them for their care of culture and of country, and pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging. But I'd also like to acknowledge any First Nations people who may be joining us today. Material Histories is a seminar series offered jointly by the Old Treasury Building and the Australian Catholic University. In each discussion, we explore an aspect of material history through an object or a series of objects. The seminars are open to anyone who's interested in material history, and we hope to cast the subject net widely in terms of both time and place. So if you're interested in contributing a seminar, please do get in touch. We'll pop some email addresses on the screen at the end of the seminar. It's now my great pleasure to introduce Professor Joy Dumosi, AM, who will chair the discussion today. Joy is Dean of the National School of Arts and Humanities at ACU. She's published widely in the field of Australian history and specifically in the history of memory and war, the history of emotions, and the history of migration. Her most recent book is The Humanitarians, Child War Refugees and Humanitarianism in a Transnational World, 1919 to 1975. Thank you, Joy, and over to you.
Thank you, Margaret. I'd like to join Margaret in welcoming you all today to our Material History seminar. And I too would like to pay my respects to the Indigenous owners of the lands on which we're coming. And in my case, it's the land of the Wurundjeri peoples of the Kulin Nation, and to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'm very pleased to be chairing this wonderful seminar. It brings together a partnership between ACU and the Old Treasury Building, as well as showcasing the very best and outstanding scholarship that we have in the field of material histories. Our two speakers, Deborah Tout-Smith and Lorinda Kramer, will share their material histories with us on objects of war. What a great topic. So it is my absolute great pleasure to first introduce Deborah Tout-Smith. Deb is Senior Curator, Home and Community in the History and Technology Department of Museums Victoria. Research for Deb's paper began in the lead up to the 75th anniversary of victory in the Pacific Day on the 15th of August 2020 for the Wartime Stories from the Royal Exhibition Building project. This project was funded by the Victorian Department of Premier and Cabinet, and you can see more of that online. Deb's presentation is titled Wartime in Melbourne's Exhibition Building. Over to you, Deb.
Well, thank you very much, Joy. And it's so wonderful to be here and to be able to share this with you. And I'd like to begin also by acknowledging the First Nations peoples of the land on which I work, the Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung peoples, and pay my respects to elders past and present and emerging. So in the long history of Melbourne's Royal Exhibition Buildings, its occupation by the Royal Australian Air Force during World War II has tended to be overlooked. In 1989, the floorboard replacement works revealed a treasure trove of detritus that had fallen or been pushed through the cracks during the war. It's the sort of accidents of history that curators and historians love. In the 1990s, the museum interviewed several personnel who'd been stationed there. And then, as Joy said, in 2020, we started work on the Wartime Stories project to commemorate the 75th anniversary. This project enabled us to discover more about the people who lived there and to give us insights into their experiences and what the site was like. So I'll start my overview with the words of leading aircraftsman Alan Walton, one of the interviewees, who was billeted there in 1942, and it pretty much sums up the site. It was good for exhibitions. It was no good for barracks. We would have been better off in tents. The wartime occupation of the exhibition buildings began in October 1940 when the RAAF requisitioned the buildings under the National Security General Regulations for use as a barracks for the #1 School of Technical Training. And by the end of the war, about 21,000 trainees had passed through the school, and at any one time up to 2,000 personnel lived cheek by jowl in the dusty halls, and conditions were not ideal. You see, by 1940, the exhibition's buildings complex was more than 60 years old. The huge site with its large halls, myriad outbuildings and expansive grounds was looking dated and tired. Its once brilliant showcase of architectural styles, Byzantine, Romanesque, Lombardic and Italian Renaissance, now looked like a Victorian cacophony. As well as the vast Great Hall we know today that was used by the RAAF, there were large wings facing Nicholson and Gertrude Streets, known as the Eastern and Western Annexes, and smaller infill galleries connecting the complex. The galvanised roof was rusting and leaking, as you can see from this slide, and the floor of the Great Hall was so worn and so infested with borer, it had actually broken through in places. Now, there was an oval squatted between the wings of the complex, and the entire built area of the site was about 8.5 hectares, and the entire site, including Carlton Gardens, stretches to 26 hectares. Over the years since it was first used in 1880, the complex had continued to host exhibitions, and of course, it was the site of Australia's Federation in 1901. And the buildings had prior form in relation to war. After World War I, when returning troops brought back the Spanish flu, it was used as a sick hospital, which wasn't a very auspicious first use of the site for accommodation. The site then became home to Australia's the first version of the Australian War Memorial, the Australian War Museum, which remained there until 1925 and included large displays of memorabilia, photographs and war loot. And even after the displays were removed to Sydney, then Canberra, the War Memorial's main store remained at the exhibition buildings until the 1940s during wartime, and the site hosted the Australian War Memorial's Melbourne branch office until 1971. And the site also had other occupants, including the Motor Registration Branch, the Country Roads Board, the Milk Board, the Liquid Fuel Control Board, and the State Rivers and Water Supply Commission, and some other rather more unusual occupants, which I'll talk about shortly. Their presence confirms that the public was able to come and go freely on the site, although not into the main Great Hall and other spaces used specifically by the RAAF. Before the RAAF took over the site in October 1940, there was one last hurrah. The Royal Show was held in September because the showgrounds had already been taken over by the RAAF, and the Great Hall, which was once the grand stage for Australia's Federation, became a poultry pavilion. Very Australian. So it was a very different scene a few weeks later as hasty alterations were made for the arrival of 1,300 RAAF trainees. So the Great Hall was divided into living and sleeping dormitories, and facilities were added like toilets, showers, mess rooms, recreation rooms, officers' quarters, a post office, a telephone exchange, and 2 banks. On the oval, kitchens and laundries appeared, and a 16-bed hospital block complete with surgeries and a laboratory. So you can see the scale of these works comparing the slide you've been looking at, which shows the empty oval in 1901. And I'll just advance to the next picture there, and that's just after the war, and you can see sort of the clusters of buildings on the site. So RAAF personnel began to arrive in March 1941, so the conversion took a few months. A great number were young men, and we can assume that many were away from home for the first time. They came from all over Australia to receive technical training for ground roles in the RAAF. Many had actually joined the RAAF to become pilots or aircrew, which was much more glamorous, but their lack of high school education stymied their ambitions. There are also some WAF on site, the women, for specific work roles and meetings, and I'll share one of those stories shortly, but I haven't found evidence women were systematically billeted in the exhibition buildings. The trainees principally attended the #1 School of Technical Training in West Melbourne. Some went elsewhere, such as Melbourne Tech and the Marconi School of Wireless in Queen Street, where they did wireless training, telegraphy, Morse code, and instrument making. And some went off to William Angliss, where they learnt cooking and then practiced in the exhibition buildings, cooking for their mates. The new arrivals were in for a shock. The Great Hall was freezing cold and drafty in winter, and it had no heating, and the sleeping arrangements didn't provide much comfort. Now, I'll just proceed to ground floor plan. It's a little bit hard to see, but I'll zoom in a moment. John Ryan described the sleeping quarters with plywood sheets 6 feet high dividing most of the ground floor and balconies, making little cubicles that mostly accommodated between 4 and 16 men. And let me just zoom into there. Oh, I'll just went forward one more. There you can see at the top of that slide some of the little cubicles from the plan. Dick Thompson remembered that some slept directly on the floor on straw mattresses, while others had metal beds with cyclone wire bases topped with straw mattresses. And now I'll go to that next slide. And sorry about the quality from the newspaper, but on the left you can see the fellows on their cyclone wire beds without mattresses, and on the right stuffing mattresses with straw. The cubicles were dimly lit, and it was too dim to read, but from his upstairs cubicle, John Ryan could see all the downstairs areas, and also a trio of hooters hanging from the ceiling that blasted frighteningly and offensively loud to wake them up and announce meal times and marches. The huge spaces were noisy in other ways too. Every creak, every voice was magnified. Alan Walton remembered they had to change into sand shoes when they went inside to make their footsteps a bit quieter. The day settled into a routine for the men. They got up about 6:30, put on overalls and paraded round the gardens. Dick describes a bit of quick jumping on the spot, a bit of physical routine, and then went go for a quick route march, a very fast trotting thing down towards the city. On cold mornings, they'd shout and wake up the neighbourhood and sometimes throw each other in the pond to their superiors' disgust. And then it was down into the basement for showers. And here Dick explains it was so darn cold, you might sometimes get hot water, and other times it was freezing icy water. You got out pretty quickly. And then it was back into overalls and up to the breakfast for the line up to the servery. And you can see the dining hall in this next slide here. No, I suspect not quite as orderly as we see in this picture. The dining hall extended the full width of the building from north to south and allowed about 1,000 men to be served at a sitting. Dick remembered breakfasts of porridge, sausages and gravy, onions, maybe mashed up eggs and toast. So the stomachs full, the men then marched out en masse to training and back for lunch. And it was the same menu without the porridge. And then they marched out to training again. And it was a lot of marching and was pretty hungry in work, and they were young men. So meal times were supplemented by the Alberta Women's Club canteen, probably not what you're seeing on the left, which served meat pies and sausage rolls and apple pies and cakes and biscuits and things like the Salvation Army van on the right. On the weekends, when they weren't training, the men were expected to do more exercise, attend lectures on subjects like bomb disposal and venereal disease, and were allowed the joys of trench digging. And I'll come to those fantastic photos. Alan Walton is a person who talked about their experience, and he's one of the people in the photos. During their time off, they had a recreation area, and they had a few billiard tables and tennis tables, but Alan said they're more useless than they're worth because everyone used to be fighting over them. They were just, couple of tiny tables for over 1,000 men. Sports were played like wrestling and football and electric light cricket. There were concerts too, like one in April 1942 that saw the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra play an eclectic program that included a rousing chorus of Waltzing Matilda, Popeye the Sailor Man, and Liszt's E-flat concerto. Sometimes they explored the buildings. Dick remembers they weren't supposed to climb around the dome because it was restricted, but here's the evidence. I'll just go back there. Here's the evidence that some did. This photo shows a group up outside the dome, I think taken by duty driver Jessie Horton. And if I just move to the next slide, you'll see Jessie on site here at work. And I'll just share a few of the other rare slides of personnel on site. WAAF Sergeant's Mess, so we have women on site in that formal capacity, and dental personnel from the dental clinic. So I mentioned how noisy the Great Hall was, but it wasn't just human sounds, because within the exhibition buildings complex was an aquarium. And Dick remembered sleeping about 30 feet from the aquarium wall and hearing seals at night time popping around and snorting, as he said. The aquarium had opened way back in 1885 and had delighted generations of Melburnians, and it still did in wartime. And the aquatic spectacle, including sea anemones, cuttlefish, and 1,500 tropical fish kept warm by a coke boiler. And as well, the aquarium housed assorted beasts of land and air, including lovebirds and rabbits, and which proved easier to keep alive than the poor sea creatures, which they had to constantly replace. And there was much more to see there too, because there was also a museum on site that included an old coach, a bone shaker bicycle, a hideous vase from the French government, in inverted commas, and a letter from Lord Nelson, very eclectic. And talking of strange noises at night, there was also an on-site dance hall, the popular Palais Royal. It had long hosted all sorts of events, and it quickly got into the swing of wartime audiences. In April 1942, a Sunday night dance for the troops welcomed all naval, military and Air Force men for free, and 1,000 girls from various women's organisations to act as hostesses. As time passed, the Palais Royal seemed to have got increasingly raucous, and in 1944, you could enjoy 6 hours of fun and frolic until 2 a.m. with Harry Taylor's 14-piece broadcast orchestra. But living at the exhibition buildings came with risk. The site caught fire a couple of times, and only quick action and, frankly, luck saved the whole complex from going up. Crime was a problem too, including theft and assault. In one incident, police found a stolen watch in a shower room wall. A couple of the notes from the floorboards collection have a very abusive tone that suggests an undercurrent of violence. But outside the walls, things could be much worse. And one night, Lindsay Walter took over guard duty from a fellow trainee to find he had just saved a woman who was being murdered by the brownout killer and didn't become one of the statistics. So the floorboards letters give us a poignant glimpse into how families coped. Howard Keller here had been sick and unhappy, and his wife Nell encouraged him to go to church and to go out a little. "I don't mind," she said, "because I can trust you, but please don't drink any more beers until you're really well." The problem of excess alcohol consumption in the RAAF was so rife that their standard conduct sheet included the number of times they were drunk and when they were last drunk. So we know from other sources that some personnel struggled to adjust, and Norm White, who is a country boy, found his arrival at the exhibition buildings traumatic, and his daughters recall how homesick he was and how he cried himself to sleep on the first few nights. Royce Phillips had a very different sort of experience. We have 14 letters from the floorboards collection written to him from late 1941 to 1942. Royce was a teenage yard hand in Adelaide who wanted to be aircrew, but was accepted to be a trainee fitter. I'll just show you, there's Royce there. We learned from his letters that life in wartime Melbourne had many attractions for him: ice skating, drinking, flirting with girls. One girl fell madly in love with him. Roma Wright wrote him passionate letters and rushed out to see his unit marching by on the way to training. One of their dates, she said, was the happiest night I have ever spent in my life. And when she kept making mistakes at home, like spilling boiling water, her housemate suggested it was because she was too much in love. Now, I've highlighted a couple of passages, but they're probably illegible at that scale. But sadly for Roma, it wasn't to last. Royce pushed her letters through gaps in the floorboards of the Great Hall and soon took up with a new girl. His father was worried and sternly warned, "You said that you went out to some lady's place. Well, I hope you had a good time, but you know, son, you have to be very careful with who you mix with over there." Royce made it through safely, became a flight mechanic, served at air bases across Australia, and survived the war unscathed. Another of my favourite stories came to life when I started to research 2 identity tags labelled D.L. Quinn. I found that this was Dorothy Quinn. Dorothy was also a teenager. Here's Dorothy here. A sales assistant in Perth who served in the WAAF as a sick quarter attendant, which is probably why she was at the exhibition buildings. One night she headed out to a dance at the Palais Royal when she met the handsome and worldly Flight Lieutenant Reg Hubbard. They fell madly in love, which Reg recorded with great passion in his diary. He was posted to New Guinea, but they married the following year when he was briefly back in Melbourne. Dot fell pregnant and had to leave the WAAF. We will never know if she accidentally or deliberately threw away her ID tags when her service was terminated. Dot and Reg spent 53 happy years together, and she passed away many years ago, but Reg lived to 98 and was still alive when we did our project, and was filmed by Gatherer Media not long before he passed away, which won Best Film at the 2021 Amaga MAPTA Awards. It's a very beautiful film. And you can still see this online, and together with Royce's story and I've put the hyperlink there, but we can share that later too. Royce's story and others. There's some quite beautiful and moving accounts. So to finish this brief account, the RAAF officially left the site on October the 4th, 1946. After nearly 6 years of occupation, the exhibition buildings were left even more shabby, and over the years parts were demolished. But enough was left for it to become a World Heritage Site in 2004. The citation synthesis focuses on the complex as a surviving manifestation of the international exhibition movement of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The synthesis does not mention its wartime use by the RAAF. I hope this research will go some way to addressing this absence. Now I want to finish with a segue to Lorinda's talk in the form of a small label found under the floorboards, the wonderfully named Stamina Self-Supporting Trousers. One can never underestimate the value of comfortable trousers in peace and in war, as Lorinda will explore. Thank you.
Thank you, Deb. Thank you for that magnificent and wonderful talk, opening our eyes to an untold story about the exhibition building and its occupancy during World War II. That was just terrific. So let me now introduce our second speaker, Lorinda Kramer. Until recently, Lorinda was a research fellow in the Gender Women's History Research Centre at the Australian Catholic University. She's now a lecturer in Cultural Heritage and Museum Studies at Deakin University. The research for Lorinda's paper was undertaken as a Redmond Barry Fellow for the 2022 State Library Victoria Fellowship. Her presentation is titled "No Man is Hard to Fit, Fletcher Jones's +8 Trousers in Post-War Australia." Thanks, Lorinda.
Thanks so much, Joy. And Deb, thank you for that lovely link to my paper as well. Before I start, I too would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation as the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which I'm working from today, and their continuing connection to the land and the waters. I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. When Fletcher Jones opened his first Melbourne store in 1946, a queue of men stretched along the Collins Street footpath. They were waiting to buy a pair of +8 trousers, named for the 8 extra inches of fabric incorporated into the front of the waistband. So great was the demand, the trousers couldn't be made and sent fast enough from Jones's Warrnambool factory. Men returned day after day to stand in the queue, waiting their turn, with Jones reassuring his customers that no man was hard to fit. This moment of consumption might seem unimportant today, perhaps reminding you a little of those who now camp overnight for the latest, hottest designer sneakers. But I'd like to suggest that this moment was, in fact, deeply meaningful for those men who waited patiently on the Collins Street footpath. Ex-servicemen predominated in the queue. The caption noted of this photograph that appeared in the Age newspaper the day after Fletcher Jones's store opened. Though the caption failed to identify which store it captured, I'm fairly certain this was Fletcher Jones's, as the text went on. Melbourne's latest queue was observed today outside a Collins Street West establishment where sports trousers are a specialty. So today I'd like to explore the meaning of good fit for the body-conscious male consumer against the backdrop of Australia's returning Second World War servicemen. I'll consider why Jones's guarantee of the perfect fit was important. When some men came home from war looking different to how they'd departed, or when others suffered the indignity of being issued cheap, badly made, and ill-fitted civilian suits on demobilisation. I'll also reflect on this idea of the perfect fit for civilians who lived through rationing and clothes styling restrictions on the home front, those who'd been asked to forego fashion, to carefully and sparingly use their clothing coupons, and to resist the thriving black market. First, though, let me tell you a little more about Fletcher Jones's +8 trousers when these sit at the centre of my paper. It was this style, and this style only, that men queued to buy. And I want to be upfront. To my great disappointment, I've never seen a pair of these post-war trousers. And I suspect that Fletcher Jones would actually enjoy this fact when he hoped men would wear their trousers over many years, if not decades, and repair them along the way as they slowly wore out. But though I've never seen a pair of +8s, I have examined other Fletcher Jones's clothes, and I do feel like I know the trousers well, having searched for details about how they were made, how they looked, and how they were worn. So styled as sports trousers, +8s were made to be worn more casually than a suit, with the essential collared shirt and tie, if not a pocket square and hat. +8s might be teamed with a sports jacket in another colour instead, or with knitwear that had become popular for men in the interwar years, or even with an open neck shirt as masculine dress codes relaxed. This advertisement, placed in both the Melbourne Age and Herald newspapers the week before the store opened, is really rich in detail. It no doubt heightened anticipation as the opening day drew closer. The 8 inches of the +8s created a drape at the trousers front, and this drape style had become popular with America's Hollywood stars just before the outbreak of war. It was a loose, flowing fashion that could be applied to jackets, trousers, and suits. And the drape style's resurgence in post-war years was meteoric. Together with their drape, +8s had full cuffs, something that had been banned during clothes regulation restrictions just a few years earlier. And they were made in pure merino wool. Customers could choose from rich new shades in greys, browns, and fawns. Specially trained staff were on hand to personally measure each man, and then to fit him in one of the 72 scientific sizes available. A number that increased to 92 sizes a few months later, as you'll see here, and then grew even more. The original 72 sizes that Jones first opened with were made with different heights and shapes in mind, whether short or extra long in the leg, normal, portly, or stout around the middle. So following that brief introduction to +8s, let me step back a little, as I don't mean to suggest that Jones's business suddenly emerged in Melbourne in 1946. Rather, after Jones was medically discharged from the AIF in 1918, he received a repatriation department loan and began a hawking business. Sold clothes and goods in Victoria's Western District. He did this firstly from a wagon hitched to a pair of horses that you can see here, then later from a fleet of trucks, and you see that here. His Warrnambool tailoring and men's clothing shop opened in 1924, and here it is a few years later. And he started to make good quality, ready-to-wear trousers 10 years after that store opened. Trousers, however, would not become a core focus of his business until 1941 at the request of the Commonwealth Department of Supply. Jones noted in his memoir decades later that the Commonwealth Controller of Clothing, Alan Davis, and the Commonwealth Controller of Woolens, Jim Vickers, had visited Warrnambool that year to inspect Jones's tailoring workrooms. They were desperately in need of trousers for Australian troops, though Jones knew the enormous quantities they required were impossible to manufacture, when around 80% of his male staff had joined the Australian forces. Jones proposed that they might make smaller numbers of good quality trousers for admirals and generals, he suggested, rather than cheap army trousers. But another option soon presented itself. At a meeting held between primary producers and government officials shortly after, the delegation, according to Jones, demanded much better trousers for the saddle, and that's for men who worked the land, than what they could currently purchase. Those trousers available were not only poorly made, but unfit for purpose, these men emphasised, though they still had to use 8 of their precious clothing coupons. So Jones began to make trousers for them. He was supplied with Vickers cloth, and one loom at the Marrickville Mills in Sydney was dedicated to producing a measurement called 2 pieces per week, a length of cloth that could make around 85 to 90 pairs of trousers. A small number of skilled men were also released from war service to set up the factory for dedicated trouser production. So historians of dress and fashion before me have explored the really fascinating tensions between patriotism and fashionability across the war years, and particularly across the Second World War years, when civilians were encouraged to forego fashionable impulses to wear what they had for as long as they could. This was true in Australia, with civilians urged to create new clothes from old, extending the wearable life of garments through creative means, as the Commonwealth Rationing Commission's New Clothes from Old booklet encouraged. This booklet, in the museum's Victoria collection, suggested ways to cut down old clothes for new looks, including turning men's suits into women's wear. At the same time, John Dedman, Minister for War Organisation of Industry, introduced victory styling in 1942 in an attempt to save cloth and other supplies like buttons and thread for the war effort. I had the opportunity of examining the victory suit on the right that Dedman wore in this photograph that's now in the collection of the Australian War Memorial. Dedman modelled this suit for the press to promote new styling regulations controlling the look and shape of suits that stripped them of all non-essential features. This included removing buttons at the sleeve cuffs and cuffs on the trousers. And more alarming for some men, it also meant removing waistcoats, so turning 3-piece suits into 2-piece. Despite the wartime cloth restrictions, Jones's trousers were of better quality than could be found elsewhere. Even then, however, thin seams and poor quality thread, for example, meant they were not up to Jones's high standards. He asked his staff to have all buttons sewn on twice, for example, in an attempt to overcome shortcomings wherever possible. He was also conscious of needing to respond to new styles features as they were permitted by the Department of War Organisation of Industry. In February 1945, for example, he needed additional cloth for the full cuffs and extended waistband he was now allowed to make. Jones was preoccupied by quality, but he also aimed to make his wartime trousers comfortable and as fashionable as styling restrictions allowed. The main thing was men liked them, Jones acknowledged, of his trousers because of that full draped front. But mind you, he continued, unless they were neatly fitted, they looked a fright. John Dedman instructed that Jones's trousers be widely and thinly distributed, and that shopkeepers be trained in how to fit them, beginning the personal fittings only policy that continued long after the war ended. These personal fittings were to play a crucial part in the success of Jones's trousers when the new suit of clothing, called a civvy suit, issued to servicemen at demobilisation centres could be disappointing. Stepping out of the uniform and into a civvy suit signalled a return to civilian status. But some men received suits of poor quality, cut and manufacture. Others waited for months when stocks were low, when tailors struggled with demand, and when there was a scarcity available of raw materials and labour in the mills. Government and defence authorities were well aware of civvy suits' importance. A large portion of men entered the forces before or shortly after reaching the age of 20 years, they acknowledged. And due to the changed mode of living and natural development, have attained a stature which renders the wearing of their pre-service civilian clothing impossible. That is, the government recognised many would no longer fit in their pre-war clothes. And others might return from war missing limbs, or they might put on weight after their return. And this was particularly the case for ex-prisoners of war. Tailor and Menswear, a really fascinating Australian trade journal, suggested tailors warn returned prisoners of war that they might be better to wait a few months for a fitting. It was not just that they could be inconvenienced by a suit that didn't fit when they put on weight, but because prisoners of war suffered heightened anxiety levels and difficulties adjusting to civilian life. In this context, the trade journal reminded tailors that a misfitting suit added further distress. So in this context of body consciousness, the reputation of Jones's specially fitted trousers grew. As the war ended, Jones's factories sprung further into activity. By mid-1945, production had increased to 580 pairs, up from 342 pairs a week in June that year. Staff worked evening overtime in an attempt to finish more. In August 1946, Jones's factory reached a production high of 812 trousers in a single week, before new improvements to style, a new waistband and a hip pocket, slowed the machining down again. And here's the machine room in 1948, which I think the energy is really palpable in. Men streamed into the city when Jones's store opened in Collins Street. And he recalled in his memoir how it was an alarming experience to see the mob outside, thick and heavy and untamed. Or in this ad, described a response beyond all expectations with non-stop selling. Some men waited by the shop's doors from 6:30 each morning. Those who made it to the front of the queue and into the store on the first day were allowed 2 pairs each, but the trousers sold so quickly and the queue remained so long that the limit was reduced to 1 pair of trousers per man. The shortage of trousers and number of customers meant that it was sometimes 3 months before a man obtained his pair. During this time, Jones struggled to clothe his own staff, and he regretted that, in his words, his Collins Street's fitters looked like a piebald lot. And this humorous sketch that later appeared in the Sunday Herald remembered the queue that suggested that men in that queue were a piebald lot too. Jones was fussy on fit. He was adamant that his trousers be fit to each man's shape and size. Unless they were properly fitted, they looked crazy, Jones acknowledged of the men who were proudly wearing his pants, but terrible to behold, he shuddered, like a pair of glorified bloomers. Jones's fitters were trained to recognise body shapes or types, a sway or stooped figure, a prominent or flat seat, heavy thighs, bony hips, a rounded tummy, or prominent calves. They would then gently guide customers through the trouser fitting process. Jones's best fitters were also aware of the various adaptations that were possible to accommodate these body types so that men were happy with how their trousers looked when worn. They worked to fit customers with artificial limbs and those who used wheelchairs. Jones believed that though some surcharges for deviations away from existing styling was necessary, there should be no extra charge for men who needed adjustments because of a disability. Clothes coupons were no longer used from mid-1948, and by 1949, sales of the Melbourne shop had levelled out to between 240 and 260 pairs of trousers per day. And 121 scientific sizes were now on offer to customers, together with the second style, described as the new sturdy brother to +8s. Production continued at great pace. Jones also opened new stores in other states, including this one in Sydney, with the still important philosophies of personal fittings only, nothing but trousers, and no man is hard to fit at the centre of this store. I'll end my paper in 1950, though the Fletcher Jones business, of course, continued long after. The most gratifying feature of trading that year, Jones recorded in his director's report, was that approximately 82,800 men were personally fitted with a pair of his trousers. Fit was now firmly entrenched as one of Jones's key policies, and he aimed to increase still further the range of scientific fractional fittings based on what he recognised as man's vastly varying anatomy. No man should be hard to fit, he underlined once again, nor should any man leave his shop in anything less than the perfect pair of trousers, when these could give him confidence and make him feel comfortable about his body, whatever shape it was and whatever his wartime experience. And just very quickly, I'd like to give my thanks to the State Library of Victoria and the University of Melbourne. Through the State Library of Victoria's Fellowships program last year, I had the wonderful opportunity of exploring the really rich collections at the SLV and the University of Melbourne archives related to Fletcher Jones as part of my Redmond Barry Fellowship. And I'd also like to thank the FJ Foundation for permission to use images in this presentation. So thank you.
Thanks, Lorinda. Thank you for a riveting talk about men's clothing and the Fletcher Jones phenomena over this period. Right, well, two absolutely brilliant papers. So let me now open up for discussion. We've got a bit of time for questions to our speakers, and that includes our speakers asking questions of each other if they wish. But I'll just open now to the floor. So does anyone have any question? I think we've got a comment there. If Lorinda's interested, John Vickers is still with us and always happy to discuss Vickers Woolen Mills. That's from Rebecca. Thank you, Rebecca. Thanks for that comment. Very helpful. Always for researchers to get such things.
I would love to follow that up. I didn't know that, so that's really, really exciting. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Rebecca, for that comment. Any questions from the audience? While we're waiting, oh no, there is one. Is there one? Or one of our speakers would like to ask a question?
Joy, could I ask a question of Deb?
Of course.
You go first, and I've got one for you.
Okay, great. All right. Well, over to you, Lorinda, and then Deb. And just to say, Rebecca's also noted that the Vickers Woolen Mills has a large company archive. Well, that's music to any researcher's ears. So thank you, Rebecca, for that. So, okay, Lorinda, over to you.
Deb, what I wanted to ask, it's such a simple question, but I'm so intrigued by this floorboard collection that you've discovered, and I wanted to know a little bit more about it. How much material did you discover? So you mentioned the letters, the ID, the stamina, envelope.
Yeah.
And if I could then slightly extend on that, what that material told you above and beyond what you could have found elsewhere? You know, how did it enhance?
Yeah. That's a fantastic question, and that's one of the I could give a separate paper on what's in the collection. Perhaps I will at one stage. The collection was retrieved during works to replace the floorboards in 1989. As I understand it, it was they're mostly from the mezzanine level, but the men were billeted on both levels. Into the management of the exhibition building trustees came basically scoops of material, as I understand it. So there wasn't any sort of practice that we would hope now that, say, an archaeologist might document where in the building and that sort of thing. So basically scoops of this rubbish, in inverted commas, And it came into the Museum's Victoria collection a few years later from the trustees, and it was registered. I think it's 230 items. A lot of them are food packaging. Some of them are medicines like Aspro packets, tickets, including, I think there's a Palais Royal, there's tickets to the Luna Park and that sort of thing. Yes, food is really a prominent one, whether it's chocolates or chewing gum or, those sorts of things. But the letters are really the most interesting. And when I said that they're the sort of things that make our hearts flutter, it's particularly the letters that were never, or the notes that were never supposed to survive. And I mentioned there's one or two of them with an undertone of violence, and they're not proper letters. There's little scraps of notes. One of them, I think, is written to or from a person called Rastus, who we haven't identified. And it's incredibly vile and abusive. And it's the sort of thing that, was never intended to survive. And someone's scribbled something extremely unpleasant on a piece of paper, folded it up and given it to someone else. And that person, probably in disgust, has just got rid of it, quick sticks, shoved it through a hole in the floor. I'm never going to see it again. And it was never supposed to survive. So for me, it's the stuff isn't supposed to survive, that shows these really raw emotions. And, we have to be careful with what we make of them, because they may be passing moments. Maybe the two became the best of friends afterwards, but it's some really unpleasant stuff. We had to think about whether we'd even put them online because they are so unpleasant, but we have with a warning. So yes, there's sort of this extraordinary insight. And we've tried to, as part of this project, I worked to documenting with colleagues, get them up online so they can now be accessed as well.
That's fantastic. It sounds incredibly rich and fruitful.
Thank you. And my question for you is, it really struck me that the cues and enthusiasm of the men say so much about a need to establish a post-war identity. So I suspect if they were getting the civvy suits, I think probably were able to take their old trousers from the Air Force or the Army. I'm not entirely sure about if they could keep them. But clearly it's something more than I just need a pair of trousers. It's a pair of trousers with a particular identity, and they're being influenced by advertising, but they're probably being influenced by the styles in movies, for instance, in the late 40s and early 50s. So I just wondered if you'd had a chance to sort of explore what might be the influences on the particular Fletcher Jones style that you were talking about, which is so distinctive and so of its time.
It really is, isn't it, Deb? And I think you've really touched on what my answer is going to be already. So this was the point in time where influences from America were becoming really popular with men's clothing. And this drape style, this fuller style of trouser, had really started to kind of emerge in popularity before the war, and then really flourished after. And we've got all kinds of fantastic photographs in this post-war period of men wearing these really full, quite baggy trousers. And this is, I guess, one of the reasons for this personal fittings only policy. And Fletcher Jones really acknowledged that they needed to be fitted well, or they just look absolutely. they just wouldn't. He talks about seeing people in the street as he's walking. He could always recognize his own trousers. And if they looked really terrible, if they hadn't been fitted correctly, he would stop a man in the street and ask him which store he purchased his trousers from. And I think he strikes me as being a very lovely man. And I think it was more to make sure that the training was available to the fitters so that men really could look their best. But Deb, I think you're so right. I think there was that real urge for men as they returned to come back to a civilian lifestyle that really separated them from work, and having a new set of clothes, something that was fashionable, something that was new and kind of exciting, something that they hadn't necessarily worn before the war, I think was a really critical step of moving beyond their wartime service and returning back to this civilian lifestyle. So I really think I know it seems like such a strange thing to focus so much on a pair of trousers, but I really do think that they were hugely significant for the men who were in that queue and who wanted desperately to buy a pair.
And of all the things they might have been queuing for, yes, the thing which gave them an identity and helped them walk into this new imagined future where they could be the person they wanted to be and saw in the movies or whatever. Fascinating.
Hey, Thank you both. That was a great exchange, and we just have some comments and questions in the chat. So there was a comment earlier about recording this, and just to remind people, this is being recorded, and the recording will be available on the Old Treasury Building website. Linda Young's has a comment here, really, a sort of question. I think you mean here, Linda, uncuffed plus aids, another enduring wartime shift in standards and style. I guess workmen's trousers were always cuffless, and so maybe the return to cuffed plus eights is the same extravagance as new look skirts. Did you have a comment about that, Linda?
Yeah, it's Linda's right. The new look skirts, so these immediately in the post-war period, so Christian Dior created these gorgeous skirts, a beautiful, beautiful silhouette. And yes, there have been parallels drawn, not necessarily by me, but certainly I do agree that this extra use of fabric in this post-war period really was. And I'm sure I've seen in one Australian newspaper this a line about the masculine new look in these trousers that did have this full front, that did have the cuffs, that kind of maybe not necessarily was an extravagant use of cloth, but that suddenly incorporated more than what had been allowed during those clothes restrictions moments. And I found those restrictions really, really fascinating, because even during World War II, when the restrictions were first established and then as they slowly modified, there were many tailors who argued that you actually weren't saving that much cloth by removing your cuffs, for example. That it really didn't make much of a material difference. It may have by removing waistcoats, and certainly a lot of men wrote letters to the editor about, what the removal of waistcoats might say about them when they're on the home front, and some men would write about how, it made them feel very sloppy, or they felt, like a working class man rather than who they were. So they were, this real sense that removing waistcoats changed how a man was seen by his peers. But yeah, the addition, these little additions that incorporated extra fabrics, I do think that this says something about men as they move forward into these post-war years.
Right. Thank you, Lorinda.
And can I just
Yes.
add very quickly to that?
Yes.
It occurred to me too that this was quite a full style, and it actually built out the look of men who were emaciated. And I say that because although we talked about the exhibition buildings, but so many men came back very, very thin, whether they're prisoners of war or serving in the islands, serving in the RAAF overseas, they came back thin, and a larger man couldn't easily wear that style, which gave you a bit of substance. And I have seen examples of men looking much better shape because it gave them more bulk.
Yeah. Thanks, Deb. We have just a thank you from Kristen, who is grateful for the discovery about World War II and Air Force related matters. So thanks there, Deb. We're running out of time. So look, I might just use the chair's privilege to ask Deb a question. And just very quickly, Deb,
Yes.
summarising impact on Melbourne and of this story, like home front Melbourne and the presence of the Air Force there at the building, the exhibition buildings. I mean, were people excited to have them in the neighbourhood? Were they terrified because it sort of brought the war home?
Look, yeah, I mean that's a fantastic question, and also why does it matter today? And it's certainly a watershed time in Melbourne, and it's an untold story for so many of the big buildings and smaller buildings that were requisitioned, and I think we've got a lot more to do. But for people who live in the neighbourhood, there were really mixed views. So the neighbours complained about the shouting of the men as they went on their jolly early morning marches, and all the capers that they got up to. There were drunks, both service and non-service people in this particular area was particularly known for that. But of course they built business into the area. They economically stimulated the area. We know that some families were billeted in houses and rentals around. There's one family we interviewed just across the road. The wife and baby lived across the road from the exhibition buildings while he was billeted in the buildings. So it did economically stimulate the area, but for many communities, they just couldn't wait for the day the last men marched out, clattered down the road, and the doors shut. So
Thanks, Deb. That's a great response, and you know, it's a great story, and opening up a whole range of kind of new questions about material culture, as has, of course, Lorinda's paper as well. So, thanks to both of you, and I'm going to hand it over to Margaret now, who'll wind up the official part of the presentations. Over to you, Margaret.
Thanks, Joy.
Thanks, Joy. And thank you both. That was such a great discussion. Two wonderful speakers, Lorinda Kramer and Deb Tout-Smith. They were such different presentations, but really, really fascinating. And I've got lots of questions, but I withheld them. So I'll explore them with you both later. Looking forward to next year, we'll once again present 4 seminars in 2024. The first is scheduled for the 1st of March, and we are lucky enough to present Lorinda Kramer once again, different topic, teaming up with me this time to look at black and white in fashion. So I hope you can join us for that. It should be a lot of fun. And do please remember that we welcome proposals of future seminar topics if there is research that you would like to share with us. And you can find a page for proposals on our website, as you can see here. So once again, thank you very much to our wonderful presenters, to you, our audience, for joining us today, to the team at ACU and at the Old Treasury for supporting the series. And I hope to see you all again in March next year. Thanks very much, and goodbye.